The notification chimed on Sarah Mitchell's phone at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in early April. She was sitting in her corner office on the 32nd floor of a Chicago high-rise, watching the rain streak down the windows like tears on glass. The message was from her college roommate, Jessica Chen, and it contained just 4 words that would change everything. "We need this escape." Sarah understood immediately. They all did. 5 friends, all in their 30s now, all carrying the weight of lives that had somehow become heavier than they'd ever imagined when they were young and fearless together at Northwestern University. The group chat had been buzzing for weeks, with fragments of their individual struggles: Jessica's recent divorce, Michael's father's cancer diagnosis, Rebecca's overwhelming work stress, and David's ongoing battle with anxiety that seemed to worsen each month. The idea had started innocently enough. Rebecca Walsh, ever the practical one with her meticulous planning skills, had been scrolling through Airbnb listings during her lunch break when she stumbled upon something that made her heart skip. A cabin in Alaska, remote, pristine, perfect for people who needed to disappear from the world for a while. "Look at this place," Rebecca had typed into their group chat, attaching photos of a rustic log cabin surrounded by towering pine trees and backed by snow-capped mountains that stretched endlessly into a crystalline sky. "Crystal Pines Cabin. It's in Talkeetna, Alaska. Complete isolation. No neighbors for miles." The images were breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows that promised unobstructed views of the northern lights. A stone fireplace that looked like it could warm both body and soul. Wooden furniture that spoke of craftsmanship and care. But most importantly, it offered something they all desperately craved: silence. Michael Rodriguez had been the first to respond with enthusiasm. His usually cheerful demeanor had been strained lately, watching his father fight a battle that seemed increasingly hopeless. "I could use some peace and quiet," he'd written, and something in those simple words carried the weight of months of hospital visits and sleepless nights. David Park, their gentle giant with the kind heart that felt everything too deeply, had agreed immediately. His job as a social worker in Detroit had been wearing on him, the constant exposure to human suffering taking its toll on his sensitive soul. "When do we leave?" he'd asked, and there was something almost desperate in his eagerness. Sarah had felt that familiar pull in her chest, the one that reminded her of simpler times when the 5 of them would pile into someone's car and drive for hours just to watch the sunrise from a new place. Those days seemed like a lifetime ago now, before careers and responsibilities and the general heaviness of adult life had settled over them like a thick blanket. The planning had taken on a life of its own. Rebecca, true to her nature, had handled all the logistics with military precision. The cabin was available for the last week of April. Perfect timing, she'd noted, since they could potentially see the aurora borealis, and the weather would be mild enough for hiking, but cool enough to justify spending hours by the fire. The Airbnb listing had been sparse but promising. Only a handful of reviews, all glowing. "Absolute perfection," one guest had written. "Complete privacy and the most beautiful views you'll ever see. The silence is healing." Another had mentioned the gravel road access, noting that it added to the sense of complete separation from the outside world. The host's profile was minimal, just a first name, Robert, and a 5-star rating. The property description emphasized the isolation. Escape from everything. This cabin sits on 40 acres of pristine wilderness, accessible only by a private gravel road. Cell service is limited, which is exactly the point. Reconnect with nature and with yourself. Sarah remembered the feeling she'd had when she clicked confirm booking. It wasn't quite excitement, it was something deeper, relief maybe, or hope. The idea of 7 days without emails, without news notifications, without the constant hum of city life felt like medicine for her weary spirit. The week leading up to their departure had passed in a blur of careful planning and growing anticipation. Jessica had been particularly enthusiastic, seeing the trip as a chance to rediscover herself after the painful end of her marriage. She'd spent hours researching the area, printing out information about local wildlife and possible hiking trails, her excitement infectious and heartwarming to witness. "Did you know Talkeetna only has about 900 people?" she'd shared during one of their planning calls. "And our cabin is at least 10 miles outside even that tiny town. We'll be completely alone with nature." The morning of their departure, April 26th, had dawned grey and cloudy in Chicago. Sarah met the others at O'Hare, and seeing her 4 closest friends gathered together with their backpacks and hiking boots, she'd felt a surge of nostalgia, so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. When had they all started looking so tired? When had the lines around their eyes deepened, and when had their smiles started requiring such visible effort? The flight to Anchorage had been quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. David had spent most of the journey staring out the window, his face pressed against the glass like a child seeing snow for the first time. Michael had dozed fitfully, his phone clutched in his hand, in case the hospital called with news about his father. Rebecca had her travel itinerary spread across her lap, checking and rechecking details that were already perfectly organized. Jessica had been the most animated of the group, pointing out landmarks as they flew over the vast wilderness of Alaska. "Look at all that space," she'd whispered to Sarah, her voice filled with wonder. "All that emptiness. Doesn't it make you feel like you can breathe again?" The rental car pickup in Anchorage had gone smoothly. Rebecca had reserved a large SUV suitable for gravel roads, and the cheerful young man at the rental counter had given them a brief rundown of driving in rural Alaska. "Cell service gets pretty spotty once you head out toward Talkeetna," he'd warned with a friendly smile. "But that's probably what you're looking for, right? Most folks who rent the heavy-duty vehicles are trying to get away from it all." The drive to Talkeetna had taken them through some of the most beautiful countryside any of them had ever seen. Rolling hills covered in dense forest, snow-capped peaks stretching as far as the eye could see, and a sky so vast and blue it seemed almost artificial. They'd stopped several times just to take pictures and breathe in the clean, crisp air that tasted like freedom. Talkeetna itself was exactly what they'd hoped for, a tiny, charming town that felt like stepping back in time. Wooden buildings lined the main street, and locals moved at a pace that seemed to acknowledge that rushing was not only unnecessary, but counterproductive to enjoying life. They'd stopped for lunch at a small cafe where the waitress knew every customer by name and asked if they were the city folks heading out to Crystal Pines. "Word travels fast in a small town," she'd said with a knowing smile. "You're picked. A good time to visit. Weather's been beautiful, and you might even catch the northern lights this time of year, if you're lucky." The final leg of their journey had been the most memorable. The gravel road leading to their cabin wound through dense forest for almost 30 minutes, the trees growing thicker and taller as they drove deeper into the wilderness. The sound of gravel crunching under their tires was rhythmic and oddly soothing, and Sarah had felt something in her chest loosen with each mile they put between themselves and civilization. "This is perfect," Michael had said from the back seat, and for the first time in months, his voice had carried genuine lightness. "My phone hasn't had signal for the last 15 minutes, and I've never been happier about that." When Crystal Pine's cabin finally came into view, it had taken Sarah's breath away. The photos on Airbnb hadn't done it justice. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pine trees, their dark green branches reaching toward a sky that seemed impossibly wide and blue. The structure itself was everything they'd hoped for, rustic but comfortable, with large windows that promised spectacular views and a wraparound porch that begged for long evenings spent in rocking chairs. The silence was the first thing that struck them all. After turning off the engine, they'd sat in the car for a moment, listening to absolutely nothing. No traffic, no sirens, no voices from neighboring properties. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a bird they couldn't identify. "Listen to that," David had whispered, his voice filled with awe. Nothing, absolutely nothing. Jessica had been the first to get out of the car, stretching her arms wide and spinning in a slow circle. "I feel like I can think clearly for the first time in months," she'd announced, her face tilted toward the sky. The check-in process had been seamless. Robert, their host, had left detailed instructions in a lockbox by the front door, along with a welcome note that struck just the right tone of hospitality without intrusion. "Welcome to Crystal Pines," the note had read in careful handwriting. "I hope you find the peace and rest you're looking for. The cabin is yours for the week. Enjoy the silence, enjoy the views, and most importantly, enjoy each other's company. Cell service is minimal, which I hope you'll see as a blessing rather than an inconvenience. Sometimes the best way to reconnect is to disconnect." The interior of the cabin was everything the photos had promised and more. Exposed wooden beams, comfortable furniture arranged around a massive stone fireplace, and those floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the forest like living artwork. The kitchen was fully equipped, the bedrooms cozy and inviting, and the main living area spacious enough for all 5 of them to spread out without feeling cramped. They'd spent the first evening exploring their temporary home, claiming bedrooms, and settling in with the kind of contentment that comes from being exactly where you need to be. Rebecca had immediately begun organizing their supplies and planning meals, her natural tendency toward order a comfort to them all. Michael had built a fire, the smell of wood smoke filling the cabin with warmth and coziness. David had found a comfortable chair by the largest window and simply sat, watching the light fade from the sky with a peaceful expression none of them had seen on his face in months. Jessica had been everywhere at once, exploring every corner of the cabin with childlike enthusiasm. "There's a hot tub on the back deck," she'd announced with delight. "And look at this view from the kitchen window. We can see for miles in every direction." Sarah had felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete relaxation. The stress that had been her constant companion for so long seemed to melt away in the warmth of the fire and the company of her dearest friends. This was exactly what they'd all needed, she thought, as she watched her friends begin to look like themselves again. That first night, they'd stayed up until nearly 2 in the morning, talking and laughing in ways they hadn't in years. The absence of phones and internet had forced them back into real conversation, the kind where you looked at each other's faces instead of screens, where pauses in conversation felt comfortable rather than awkward. "We should do this every year," Jessica had said as they were finally heading to bed, her voice soft with contentment. "Just the 5 of us, somewhere beautiful and quiet, where we can remember who we are when we're not buried under all the noise of daily life." They'd all agreed enthusiastically, already making plans for future escapes, future adventures, future moments of peace, stolen from their increasingly complicated lives. The cabin felt like a sanctuary, a place where healing was not just possible, but inevitable. As Sarah had drifted off to sleep that first night, listening to the absolute silence, beyond her window, she'd felt profoundly grateful. Grateful for friends who understood the need for escape, grateful for a place beautiful enough to restore faith in the world, and grateful for the week of peace that stretched ahead of them like a promise. None of them could have imagined that, within hours, that peace would be shattered in ways they couldn't have conceived. None of them knew that their perfect escape was about to become something else entirely, something that would test not just their friendship, but their very survival instincts. The silence they'd found so healing was about to become something far more ominous, and the isolation they'd craved would soon feel less like freedom and more like a trap. But in those final moments of innocence, as they settled into their comfortable beds in their beautiful cabin, surrounded by pristine wilderness. They were simply 5 friends who had found exactly what they were looking for. The weight of their individual struggles felt lighter here. The beauty of their surroundings, a balm for spirits that had been bruised by life's difficulties. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new adventures, and new reasons to be grateful for this perfect escape from the world. At least that's what they all believed, as sleep claimed them one by one, the silence of the Alaskan wilderness wrapping around Crystal Pine's cabin like a protective embrace. The last thing Sarah remembered before sleep took her was the sound of that silence, complete, profound, and somehow alive with possibility. It was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard, and she fell asleep smiling, already looking forward to a week of mornings that would begin with nothing but that perfect, healing quiet. The second morning at Crystal Pines dawned grey and overcast, with low clouds hanging over the pine trees like a soft blanket. Sarah woke to the sound of Rebecca moving quietly around the kitchen, the gentle clink of coffee mugs and the whisper of the coffee maker, a comforting soundtrack to the continuation of their peaceful retreat. She lay in bed for a few extra minutes, savoring the absolute stillness beyond her window. At home in Chicago, her mornings began with the jarring buzz of her alarm, followed immediately by the sounds of traffic, construction, and the general chaos of urban life. Here, she could actually hear her own breathing, could feel her heartbeat without the interference of external noise. When she finally padded into the main living area, still in her pajamas and fuzzy slippers, she found Rebecca curled up in one of the large chairs by the window, a steaming mug in her hands and a look of profound peace on her face that Sarah hadn't seen in years. "Good morning," Rebecca whispered, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the sanctity of the silence. "I've been watching a family of deer in the clearing. They've been there for almost an hour, just grazing. It's like they know this place is safe." Sarah poured herself coffee and joined her friend by the window. Sure enough, 3 deer, 2 adults and a young one, were moving slowly through the grass about 50 yards from the cabin, completely unafraid and utterly graceful. Watching them felt like meditation, their unhurried movements a reminder that not everything in the world operated on human schedules and human anxiety. One by one, the others emerged from their bedrooms, drawn by the smell of coffee and the quiet murmur of voices. Michael appeared looking more rested than he had in months, his usually tense shoulders relaxed and his smile genuine rather than forced. David stretched like a contented cat, announcing that he'd slept better than he had since childhood. Jessica bounced in with characteristic energy, already dressed for hiking and eager to explore their surroundings. They'd planned this day carefully during their late-night conversations. A moderate hike through the forest, following one of the trails Rebecca had researched, with a picnic lunch by a small lake about 3 miles from the cabin. Nothing strenuous, nothing competitive, just a gentle exploration of the beautiful wilderness that surrounded their temporary home. The morning passed in perfect contentment. They prepared trail mix and sandwiches, filled water bottles, and gathered light jackets for the changeable mountain weather. The simple act of preparing for an adventure together felt healing in itself, reminiscent of countless college weekends when they'd pile into someone's car and drive to state parks or hiking trails, young and invincible and certain that the world was full of beautiful places waiting to be discovered. The trailhead was only a 10-minute walk from the cabin, marked by a simple wooden sign that read, "Pine Lake Trail, 2.8 miles." The path was well maintained, but clearly not heavily traveled, winding through dense forest where the canopy was so thick that even at midday, the light filtered down in golden shafts that made everything look magical. They fell into a comfortable hiking rhythm, sometimes walking in pairs and chatting quietly, sometimes spreading out single file to navigate narrower sections of trail. The forest around them was alive with subtle sounds. The rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the call of birds they couldn't identify, the whisper of wind through branches high overhead. "I'd forgotten how much I love this," David said. During one of their brief rest stops, his face turned up toward the canopy, being surrounded by growing things, breathing clean air, feeling like a small part of something much bigger and more important than my daily problems. Jessica had been documenting their hike with her camera, but not in the frantic, social media-driven way that had become second nature to all of them in recent years. Instead, she was taking time with each shot, really looking at what she was capturing, treating the photography as another form of meditation rather than content creation. "I'm not even thinking about posting any of these," she admitted as they walked. "They're just for us, for remembering this feeling. Sometimes I think the urge to share everything immediately prevents us from really experiencing it in the moment." The lake, when they finally reached it, was everything they'd hoped for and more. A perfect circle of clear, dark water surrounded by tall pines, with snow-capped mountains visible in the distance through breaks in the tree line. The silence here was even more profound than at the cabin, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the occasional call of a loon from somewhere across the lake. They spread their picnic on a fallen log near the water's edge and ate their simple lunch in companionable quiet, each lost in their own thoughts but comfortably aware of the other's presence. Michael skipped stones across the water with the focused concentration of someone trying to quiet his mind. Rebecca lay back on the mossy ground and watched clouds drift across the patch of sky visible through the trees. David and Sarah walked slowly around the lake's perimeter, not talking much, but simply enjoying the rhythm of walking together through such beautiful surroundings. "This is what I needed," Sarah said softly as they completed their circuit, "to remember that the world is bigger than my problems, that there are still places where time moves differently, where you can hear yourself think." The hike back to the cabin passed in the same peaceful rhythm as the morning, but as they emerged from the forest into the clearing where crystal pines sat, something felt different. Sarah couldn't put her finger on what had changed, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere that made her pause and look around more carefully. "Does something seem off to you?" she asked Rebecca, who was walking beside her. Rebecca stopped and followed Sarah's gaze across the clearing. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "Maybe it's nothing, just a feeling." But as they approached the cabin, that feeling intensified. The front door, which they were certain they'd locked before leaving for their hike, was slightly ajar. Not wide open, just enough to notice if you were looking carefully. Michael, who had been walking ahead of the group, stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Did we leave the door open?" he asked, his voice carrying the first note of concern any of them had felt since arriving. "No," Rebecca said definitively. "I locked it myself. I remember checking it twice." They all gathered at the bottom of the steps, staring at the partially open door with growing unease. The cheerful welcome they'd expected to feel upon returning to their sanctuary was replaced by something that made Sarah's stomach tighten with anxiety. "Maybe the wind blew it open," Jessica suggested, but her voice carried doubt. They'd all noticed how solid and heavy the cabin door was, how well it fit in its frame. David, ever the practical one, stepped forward. "Let's just check it out," he said, though his tone was more cautious than confident. "I'm sure there's a simple explanation." They climbed the porch steps as a group, bunched together in a way that revealed their shared nervousness. Michael pushed the door open wider and called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" Silence answered them, but not the comfortable, healing silence they'd grown to love. This silence felt different, expectant somehow, charged with possibility that made them all hesitate before entering their own temporary home. The interior of the cabin looked exactly as they'd left it, which should have been reassuring, but somehow wasn't. Their breakfast dishes were still on the kitchen counter, where Rebecca had left them to wash later. The fire in the fireplace had burned down to cold ashes, exactly as expected. Their personal belongings were undisturbed. Their rooms looked untouched. "See?" Jessica said, but her voice was a little too bright, a little too forced. "Everything's fine. The door must have just settled wrong or something." But Rebecca was examining the doorframe with the careful attention to detail that made her such a good project manager. "Look at this," she said quietly, running her finger along the edge of the door. "These scratches around the lock, they look fresh." They all gathered around to see what she was pointing out. Sure enough, there were small scratches in the wood, around the lock mechanism, as if someone had been working at it with tools. "That could have been there already," Michael said, but he didn't sound convinced. "We didn't examine the door that closely when we arrived." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "But why would someone come here? We're miles from anywhere. There's nothing to steal, and the place was obviously occupied." They spent the next hour doing a thorough inventory of their belongings and the cabin's contents. Nothing was missing, nothing was disturbed. If someone had been inside, they'd been incredibly careful not to leave any evidence of their presence beyond the possibly tampered lock. "Maybe we're being paranoid," David suggested as they reconvened in the living room. "Maybe the door really did just settle or warp or whatever old wooden doors do. Maybe those scratches have been there for years and we just noticed them because we're looking for problems." A part of Sarah wanted to believe this rational explanation. The alternative, that someone had deliberately entered their sanctuary while they were away, was too unsettling to contemplate. Who would do such a thing, and why? They were just 5 friends on vacation, far from home, bothering no one. But as the afternoon wore on, the feeling of unease persisted. They all found themselves glancing at the windows more frequently, listening more carefully to every sound from outside, checking and rechecking that the door was properly locked. The peace they'd felt that morning seemed fragile now, tinged with an awareness that their isolation might not be as complete as they'd thought. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, Rebecca brought up something that had been nagging at her all afternoon. "I've been thinking about what the rental car guy said in Anchorage," she said carefully, "about how people who rent the heavy-duty vehicles are usually trying to get away from it all. What if we're not the only ones out here? What if there are other people in the area who don't want to be found?" "You mean like criminals?" Jessica asked, her voice rising slightly. "Not necessarily criminals," Rebecca replied. "Just people who have reasons for wanting to be completely isolated, people who might not appreciate visitors in what they consider their territory." Michael was slicing vegetables for their stir-fry, but Sarah noticed his movements had become more precise, more controlled, as if he was using the familiar task to manage his rising anxiety. "But this is legitimate," he said. "We rented this place through Airbnb. We have every right to be here." "I know that," Rebecca said. "I'm just trying to think through all the possibilities. Maybe someone saw us arrive and wanted to check us out while we were away. Maybe they were just curious about who was using the cabin." David, who had been unusually quiet since they discovered the door issue, finally spoke up. "What bothers me most is how careful they were," he said slowly. "If someone just wanted to see who was here, why be so secretive about it? Why not just knock on the door and introduce themselves? The fact that they came while we were away and tried not to leave evidence, that suggests they didn't want us to know they'd been here." The conversation continued as they cooked and ate their dinner, but the easy camaraderie of the previous evening was missing. They were all thinking the same thing, though none of them wanted to voice it directly. Their perfect escape suddenly felt less safe, less private, less peaceful than they'd believed. As night fell and the darkness outside their windows became complete, their awareness of their isolation shifted from comforting to concerning. During their first night, the absence of neighbors and the distance from town had felt like a blessing. Tonight, those same facts felt more ominous. If something did happen, if someone did mean them harm, there was no one close enough to hear them call for help. They stayed up later than they'd planned, reluctant to separate and go to their individual bedrooms. Instead, they gathered around the fireplace, keeping the conversation light, but all of them hyper-aware of every sound from outside. When the wind picked up and pine branches began scraping against the roof, they all tensed and looked toward the ceiling. "It's just the trees," Sarah said, as much to reassure herself as the others. "Of course it is," Jessica agreed quickly. "What else would it be?" But they were all thinking about other possibilities now, and the innocent sounds of the forest had taken on more sinister potential meanings. Every rustle in the underbrush could be an animal, or it could be something else. Every crack of a branch could be natural settling, or it could be someone moving through the woods around their cabin. When they finally did go to bed, Sarah found herself lying awake for a long time, listening to the silence that had seemed so healing just 24 hours earlier. Now that same silence felt loaded with possibility, with the potential for sounds she didn't want to hear. She found herself straining to distinguish between the natural sounds of the forest and anything that might suggest human presence. Sometime after midnight, she thought she heard something that made her sit up in bed, her heart suddenly racing. It had sounded like footsteps on gravel, like someone walking slowly past the cabin. She held her breath and listened intently, but the sound didn't repeat. After several minutes of hearing nothing but her own pulse in her ears, she began to doubt whether she'd heard anything at all. But sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with dreams of dark figures moving through the forest, of locked doors standing open, of safety that turned out to be illusion. In her dreams, the silence of the wilderness wasn't peaceful at all. It was the silence of something waiting, something watching, something preparing to make its presence known. When morning came, she woke feeling tired rather than rested, and she could see in her friends' faces that they'd all spent the night wrestling with similar unease. Their perfect escape was still beautiful, still peaceful in many ways, but it no longer felt entirely safe. The question that none of them wanted to ask directly hung in the air between them. If someone was watching them, what did they want? And how long before they made their intentions clear? The third day at Crystal Pines began with a discovery that shattered any remaining illusion of their perfect isolation. Sarah woke before dawn, restless and unable to return to sleep after a night filled with anxious dreams. She made coffee in the quiet kitchen and settled into her favorite chair by the window to watch the sunrise paint the forest in shades of gold and amber. That's when she saw them. Footprints in the soft earth around the cabin, not animal tracks. She'd become familiar with those over the past few days. These were clearly human, the distinctive tread pattern of hiking boots pressed into the damp soil near the kitchen window. The prints circled the entire cabin, as if someone had spent considerable time walking around their temporary home in the dark. Her coffee mug slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering on the wooden floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. The crash brought Rebecca running from her bedroom, hair disheveled and eyes wide with alarm. "What happened?" Rebecca asked, then stopped short when she saw Sarah's face. "What's wrong?" Sarah pointed toward the window with a trembling hand. "Look outside. Look at the ground around the cabin." Rebecca pressed her face to the glass, and Sarah watched the color drain from her friend's complexion as the implications became clear. "Oh God," Rebecca whispered. "Someone was here last night, while we were sleeping." The sound of their voices and the broken mug had awakened the others. Michael, David, and Jessica emerged from their rooms in various states of undress and confusion, but their sleepy disorientation vanished the moment they understood what Sarah and Rebecca were looking at. They went outside as a group, still in their pajamas and barefoot, driven by a need to confirm what they could see clearly through the windows. The footprints were unmistakable, and they told a story that made Sarah's blood run cold. Someone had walked slowly around their cabin multiple times, pausing at each window as if studying the interior, learning the layout, watching them sleep. "These are fresh," David said, kneeling beside one particularly clear print near the front porch. His voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the effort it took to maintain that calm. "The edges are still sharp. This happened within the last few hours." Jessica wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the morning air. "They were watching us," she said, her voice small and frightened. "Someone stood outside our windows and watched us sleep." The violation felt profound and personal. Their sanctuary had been breached not just physically, but psychologically. The safety they'd felt inside their temporary home was revealed to be nothing more than illusion, as flimsy as the walls that had failed to keep their unknown watcher at bay. "We need to call the police," Rebecca said, her practical nature asserting itself despite her obvious fear. "This is stalking, harassment, breaking and entering, something. They'll know what to do." But when Michael tried his cell phone, the reality of their isolation became starkly apparent. No signal, not even a single bar. They'd known cell service was limited here, but in their desire for digital detox, they hadn't considered how that might impact their safety. "The rental car," David suggested. "We could drive until we get signal, or back to town if necessary. There has to be a police station in Talkeetna." The idea of leaving their cabin felt both necessary and terrifying. Necessary because they clearly needed help, but terrifying because it meant abandoning whatever small sense of security the familiar walls provided. What if their watcher was still out there in the forest? What if leaving the cabin exposed them to even greater danger? But staying felt impossible now. The thought of spending another night in a place where someone could walk freely around the perimeter, watching and waiting for who knew what purpose, was unbearable. They needed help, they needed answers, and they needed to feel safe again. They dressed quickly and gathered their essential belongings, moving with the urgent efficiency of people fleeing a disaster. The breakfast they'd planned, the lazy morning by the fire, the continued exploration of their beautiful surroundings, all of that was forgotten in their desperate need to reach civilization and safety. The drive back toward Talkeetna felt endless. Every shadow in the forest seemed to hide a potential threat. Every turn in the gravel road, a possible ambush. Sarah found herself checking the mirrors obsessively, searching for signs of pursuit, though what she expected to see, she couldn't say. Cell signal returned gradually as they neared town, and Rebecca immediately began trying to research local law enforcement. "There's a state trooper post in Talkeetna," she announced with relief, "and it looks like they handle this kind of thing for the whole area." The trooper station was a small utilitarian building on the outskirts of town, and the officer who greeted them, Trooper Janet Williams, was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that immediately made Sarah feel more secure. "You folks look shaken up," Trooper Williams observed as she led them into a small conference room. "Why don't you tell me what happened, and we'll see what we can do to help." They took turns describing their experience, from the potentially tampered lock to the discovery of the footprints that morning. Trooper Williams listened without interruption, taking careful notes and asking clarifying questions that demonstrated she was taking their concerns seriously. "You were right to come in," she said when they'd finished their account. "What you're describing is definitely cause for concern. The Crystal Pines property has been, well, let's just say it's been on our radar for a while." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean?" Trooper Williams hesitated, clearly weighing how much to share. "The property has changed hands several times over the years, and there have been complaints from previous renters. Nothing quite like what you've described, but reports of feeling watched, unexplained disturbances, that sort of thing." "And you haven't investigated?" Michael asked, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. "We've done what we can," Trooper Williams replied, But investigating reports of feeling watched in the middle of 40 acres of wilderness is challenging, especially when no actual crimes have been committed. Your situation is different, though. The footprints, the possible tampering with the lock, those are concrete evidence that someone was on the property without permission. She explained their options with professional thoroughness. They could file a formal complaint, which would trigger an investigation. She could arrange for increased patrols in the area, though she warned that their remote location made regular monitoring difficult. Most importantly, she strongly advised them not to return to the cabin until the situation was resolved. "Where exactly are we supposed to go?" Jessica asked. "Our flights home aren't for 4 more days, and I don't think any of us can afford last-minute changes." Trooper Williams consulted a local business directory. "There's a bed and breakfast in town, Denali Dreams. It's run by a local family, safe and comfortable. They might have rooms available, and the owners, Tom and Martha Peterson, know everyone in the area. If anyone can give you more background on what's been happening out at Crystal Pines, it would be them." The decision to abandon their planned retreat felt like admitting defeat, but none of them seriously considered returning to the cabin. The violation of their safety was too fresh, too frightening to ignore. Whatever they'd hoped to find in the wilderness, peace, healing, renewal, had been poisoned by the knowledge that they were not alone and not safe. Denali Dreams. Bed and breakfast was everything the cabin was not. Right in the heart of town, surrounded by neighbors, with plenty of people around during all hours of the day and night. Martha Peterson, a warm woman in her 60s with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes, welcomed them with the kind of maternal concern that made Sarah want to cry with relief. "Oh, you poor dears," Martha said, when Trooper Williams briefly explained their situation. "Of course we have rooms for you, and don't you worry about a thing. You're safe here. Tom and I have been running this place for 30 years, and we've never had so much as a stolen bicycle in all that time." Over dinner that evening in the bed and breakfast's cozy dining room, Martha shared what she knew about Crystal Pines and its history. The information was troubling and helped explain some of the strange occurrences they'd experienced. "That property has been nothing but trouble for as long as I can remember," Martha said, her voice low and concerned. "It was abandoned for almost 20 years before someone started renting it out on those internet sites. The original owner just up and disappeared one day back in the 90s, left everything behind like he'd fled in the middle of the night." She went on to explain that there had been other incidents over the years. Hikers reporting the feeling of being followed in that area of the forest, campers finding evidence that someone had been through their belongings while they slept, occasional sightings of figures moving through the trees who vanished when approached. "Most folks around here just avoid that whole section of woods," Martha continued. "There's plenty of other beautiful places to hike and camp without dealing with whatever's going on out there. The fact that someone's renting that cabin to unsuspecting tourists, well, it just doesn't sit right with me." David asked the question. They were all thinking, "Do you think it's just one person, or could there be more than one?" Martha's expression grew troubled. "Hard to say. Some of the reports over the years have suggested there might be multiple people involved. Maybe folks who've been living rough in the woods for a long time, the kind of people who don't want to be found and don't appreciate visitors in what they've come to think of as their territory." That night, despite the comfort and security of the bed and breakfast, Sarah found sleep elusive once again. The events of the past few days played on repeat in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal was far from over. They were safe for now, surrounded by the warmth and protection of civilization, but their mysterious watcher was still out there in the forest. More troubling was the growing realization that what they'd experienced at Crystal Pines might not have been random. The careful surveillance, the deliberate intimidation, the escalating nature of the incidents, it all suggested purpose rather than coincidence. Someone had wanted them to feel watched, wanted them to feel unsafe, wanted them to leave. The question that kept her awake was simple but terrifying. What would have happened if they'd stayed? If they hadn't discovered the footprints? If they'd remained at the cabin for the full week they'd planned? What would their unseen watcher have done next? As she finally drifted off to sleep in the early hours of the morning, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they'd escaped something far worse than simple harassment, something that might have started with watching but could have ended in ways too frightening to contemplate. Their perfect escape had become a nightmare, but at least it was a nightmare they'd survived. The real question now was whether their ordeal was truly over, or if leaving Crystal Pines had simply marked the end of the first act in a drama whose conclusion remained terrifyingly uncertain. The call came at 3:17 a.m. on their second night at Denali Dream's bed and breakfast. Sarah jerked awake to the sound of her cell phone buzzing urgently against the wooden nightstand, the harsh electronic sound jarring in the peaceful silence of the small town inn. The caller ID showed Trooper Williams, and Sarah's heart immediately began racing. Police don't call in the middle of the night with good news. Ms. Mitchell, I'm sorry to wake you, but there's been a development in your case. Can you wake your friends and meet me at the station? It's important. The drive through empty streets felt surreal, like moving through a dream where familiar surroundings had taken on ominous new meanings. The five friends huddled together in their rental car, speculation and fear filling the silence as they tried to imagine what could be so urgent that it couldn't wait until morning. Trooper Williams was waiting for them with coffee and a grim expression that immediately confirmed their worst fears. We sent a patrol out to Crystal Pines this evening, she began without preamble. What we found there changes everything about your situation. She led them to the same conference room where they'd given their initial statement, but this time she was accompanied by another officer, Sergeant Mike Harrison from the State Police Major Crimes Unit. The presence of a detective from Major Crimes made Sarah's stomach clench with dread. The cabin has been completely ransacked, Trooper Williams continued. Every room torn apart, furniture overturned, personal belongings scattered everywhere. But that's not the most concerning part. Sergeant Harrison took over, his voice carefully controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. We found evidence that suggests your harassment wasn't random. There were photographs printed from what appears to be a digital camera, dozens of them, taken over several days, photos of all of you. The room seemed to tilt around Sarah as the implications hit her. Photos of us. When? How? Long-range telephoto lens, from what our tech specialist can determine. Someone was documenting your activities from the moment you arrived. Your hike to the lake, your meals on the porch, your movements around the cabin. Whoever was watching. You had been planning something for quite some time. Jessica made a small, frightened sound. Planning what? Oh, that's what we're trying to determine, Sergeant Harrison replied. But the photographs weren't the only things we found. There were detailed notes about your schedules, your individual habits, even speculation about which of you would be easiest to approach. The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah felt bile rise in her throat as she realized how close they'd come to something unspeakably terrible. We also found supplies, Trooper Williams added quietly. Rope, duct tape, items that suggest your stalker was preparing for more than just observation. Michael, who had been silent since they'd arrived, finally spoke. You're saying someone was planning to kidnap us? Or worse? We're saying the evidence suggests this situation could have escalated very quickly if you hadn't left when you did, Sergeant Harrison replied. Your decision to come to us probably saved your lives. The next hour passed in a blur of questions, forms, and increasingly frightening revelations. The mysterious watcher had left behind a camp deep in the woods, about a mile from the cabin. A sophisticated setup that suggested someone with extensive outdoor experience and knowledge of the area. The camp had been abandoned recently, but not before whoever was using it had gathered a disturbing amount of information about their intended targets. The good news is that we have physical evidence now, Trooper Williams explained. DNA samples from the camp, fingerprints from some of the items left behind, tire tracks from a vehicle we hadn't seen before. This person made mistakes when they ransacked the cabin, left traces they probably didn't intend to leave. But there was bad news too. The evidence suggested their stalker wasn't working alone. Multiple sets of footprints, different handwriting in the notes, supplies enough for several people. What they'd experienced wasn't the work of a single disturbed individual, but rather a coordinated effort by multiple people with unclear but clearly malicious intentions. "We've issued a regional alert," Sergeant Harrison informed them. "All law enforcement agencies in Alaska have been notified, and we're working with federal authorities since this involves potential kidnapping across state lines. You're all going to be safe, but we need you to be very careful until we have these people in custody." The recommendation was that they leave Alaska immediately, change their flights, get home as quickly as possible, and maintain low profiles until the investigation was concluded. The thought of running felt cowardly, but the alternative, staying in a place where dangerous people were actively hunting them, was clearly not viable. "What about other guests?" Rebecca asked, her practical mind focusing on future potential. "Victims. What's to stop them from doing this to someone else who rents the cabin?" "The listing has been removed from all rental platforms," Trooper Williams assured her. "And we're working with the platform companies to investigate how the property was listed in the first place. The supposed owner, the one whose name was on the Airbnb account, doesn't appear to exist." The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to emerge, and the picture they formed was more frightening than any of them had imagined. Crystal Pines wasn't just an isolated cabin with a troublesome history. It was apparently being used as a trap, a way to lure unsuspecting visitors to a place where they could be watched, studied, and potentially victimized by people who had turned predation into a systematic operation. As dawn broke over Talkeetna, they found themselves making hurried arrangements to leave Alaska far earlier than they'd planned. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. They'd come seeking escape from their stressful lives, only to find themselves fleeing from something far worse than anything they'd left behind. The drive to Anchorage felt different from their arrival journey just days earlier. Instead of marveling at the beautiful wilderness, they found themselves seeing potential hiding places for dangerous people. The isolation that had seemed so appealing now felt threatening. The vast spaces not peaceful, but full of unknown dangers. At the airport, as they waited for their flights home, Martha Peterson from the bed and breakfast called Sarah's cell phone. Her voice was shaken but determined. "I wanted you to know," Martha said. "Tom and I have been asking around town since you left, talking to people, trying to piece together what's been happening out at Crystal Pines. We found an old-timer who remembers when the original owner disappeared back in the 90s. Sarah put the call on speaker so her friends could hear. "According to Earl, he's lived here his whole life. The original owner of that property got mixed up with some bad people. Folks who came up from the lower 48 looking for places to hide from the law. Earl thinks they never left the area, just went deeper into the woods and learned to live off the grid." The implication was chilling. They hadn't stumbled into the territory of a single dangerous individual, but rather an entire community of people who had reasons to avoid contact with law enforcement and civilization in general. "The scary part," Martha continued, "is that Earl says there have been disappearances over the years, people who came to visit the area and just never went home. Not many, and not often enough to draw attention, but enough that some of us old-timers have wondered about it." Sarah felt her hands begin to shake as she realized how close they'd come to becoming part of that terrible pattern. If they hadn't noticed the tampering with the lock, if they hadn't seen the footprints, if they'd trusted their initial impression of safety and isolation. The flights home were subdued affairs. each of them lost in their own thoughts about what they'd experienced and what it meant for their future sense of security. The world felt different now, more dangerous, full of hidden threats they'd never considered before. But there was something else too, something that emerged gradually as the shock began to fade. They'd faced something terrible together and survived it. They'd protected each other, made good decisions under pressure, and gotten themselves to safety when it mattered most. The friendship that had brought them to Alaska in the first place had quite literally saved their lives. Over the following weeks, as the investigation continued and their normal lives resumed, they stayed in closer contact than they had in years. The shared trauma had bonded them in ways that transcended their previous casual friendship, creating a connection forged in real crisis and mutual protection. 3 months later, Sergeant Harrison called Sarah with news. They'd arrested 4 people in connection with the Crystal Pines incidents, members of a group that had been living illegally in the Alaskan wilderness for over 2 decades, supporting themselves through various criminal activities, including the systematic targeting of isolated tourists. "Your case broke it wide open," Harrison explained. "The evidence we found at the cabin led us to their main camp, and from there, we were able to connect them to several other incidents over the years. You probably weren't their first intended victims, but you were smart enough and quick enough to make sure you weren't actual victims." The arrests brought closure, but also a sobering awareness of how different their story could have ended. In the months that followed, Sarah found herself thinking often about the randomness of survival, about how small decisions and moments of intuition could mean the difference between a frightening story to tell and a tragedy that destroyed families. But she also thought about the power of friendship, about how people who truly care for each other can protect and save each other in ways that go far beyond casual support. Their planned escape from urban stress had become something far more profound, a test that revealed the true strength of their bonds and their ability to face the unknown together. The 5 friends never did take another vacation together. The experience had changed their relationship to travel, to isolation, to the very idea of escape. But they didn't need to travel together to maintain the connection that their ordeal had revealed. They'd learned that real friendship isn't about shared adventures in beautiful places. It's about standing together when the beautiful places turn dangerous, about protecting each other when protection is needed most. The Crystal Pines mystery had been solved, the criminals arrested, the immediate danger ended. But the deeper mystery, how ordinary people find the courage to save themselves and each other when faced with the unthinkable, that mystery had revealed its answer in the actions of 5 friends who refused to become victims. Their story became a reminder that sometimes the most important escapes aren't from the pressures of daily life, but from the real dangers that can emerge when we least expect them. And sometimes the most valuable discoveries aren't about beautiful places or peaceful moments, but about the strength we find in ourselves and the people we love when survival depends on both. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the power of friendship and the importance of trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, please take a moment to share your thoughts. Hit that like button if these 5 friends' courage resonated with you, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the strength of the human spirit in the face of unthinkable circumstances. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where your instincts warned you of danger? Have you experienced the kind of friendship that would protect you no matter what? Share your stories in the comments below. Your experiences might help someone else recognize the warning signs or find the courage to trust their gut when it matters most. Remember, the most important escapes aren't always from our daily struggles. Sometimes they're from situations that could change our lives forever. Stay safe, trust your instincts, and never underestimate the power of people who truly have your back.